"You can't just tear down community property like that." That's what their HOA rep yelled at me after they built an entire house on my mountain without asking. Tell me how this makes any sense. They trespassed, they built a whole damn house, and now I'm the one facing court? I've been trying to stay calm, to take the high road, but there's only so many times you can get slapped in the face before you swing back. Every neighbor, every meeting, every time I tried to speak up, I was made to look like the crazy one. But something about this whole setup feels wrong. Let me know in the comments if this sounds insane to you too. Coming back to McLaren Ridge after 2 years felt like returning from another lifetime. Sarah's cancer battle had consumed everything. Every day, every thought. Now she was gone, and I was 59 years old, standing on the property my grandfather left me, trying to figure out what came next. The plan was simple enough. Live quietly in the old cabin, maybe do some consulting work for the Forestry Service. Watch the seasons change without sirens or emergency calls pulling me away. That plan lasted exactly 47 minutes after I parked my truck. Walking the eastern slope where I used to play as a kid, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A massive 3-story structure sat right where the ridgeline used to be clear. Untreated cedar posts, pine siding, wraparound decks on every level. Someone had built what looked like a luxury retreat house smack in the middle of what my grandfather always called the death zone. I stood there staring at this thing, trying to process what I was seeing. 32 years fighting wildfires teaches you to spot combustible nightmares from a mile away. This wasn't just poorly planned construction. This was a tinderbox waiting for a match. The whole structure was positioned exactly where prevailing winds would carry flames straight down into the valley. Every single building material they had chosen might as well have been soaked in gasoline. The outdoor fire pit made me actually laugh out loud, but not from amusement. They'd installed a stone circle with cedar benches arranged around it, maybe 15 feet from the main structure. I could see propane tanks lined up against the north wall, probably for heating and cooking. Looking closer, I noticed they'd even added exterior lighting powered by what appeared to be diesel generators. It was like someone had designed a perfect recipe for catastrophic fire spread. Walking around the perimeter, I tried to convince myself maybe I was overreacting. Maybe my years in emergency response had made me paranoid about fire hazards. But then I touched one of the support posts with my lighter. The cedar caught flame within seconds, burning bright and fast before I stamped it out. Anyone with basic wildfire knowledge would never use untreated timber in this location. The whole ridge was a natural wind tunnel during red flag conditions. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. "Excuse me, but you're trespassing on private property." The voice belonged to a woman in expensive athletic wear, probably mid-40s, with the kind of confident stance that suggested she was used to being in charge. Her yoga pants and moisture-wicking top looked fresh from some boutique fitness store. She had that wellness industry glow about her, all organic smoothies and mindfulness retreats. Private property? I kept my voice level, though my heart was pounding. This is McLaren Ridge. My family has owned this land for over 60 years. She crossed her arms and gave me the kind of look people reserve for confused elderly relatives. "I'm Paula Grant, Wellness Director for Summit Wellness, HOA. We secured county approval for everything you see here. This retreat center will serve the healing needs of our community." I gestured toward the structure with what I hoped was obvious concern. "Ma'am, I've battled blazes for 30 years. Those timber posts are pure kindling. One spark during fire season, and this whole valley burns." Paula's expression shifted from annoyed to condescending. "Sir, our architects and contractors followed all applicable building codes. We're not going to let fear-mongering prevent us from creating a space for people to find peace and wellness." Peace and wellness. Perfect. They wanted to heal people by potentially incinerating the whole valley. I pulled out my phone and took photos of the structure from multiple angles, focusing on the untreated timber, the fire pit placement, and those propane tanks. "When did construction begin on this?" Paula checked her fitness tracker like my questions were interrupting her scheduled meditation time. Groundbreaking was 6 months ago. We'll be hosting our first retreat guests next weekend. 60 people sleeping in a structure that would become a fireball the moment conditions turned dangerous. I needed to see the permits, understand how this had gotten approved. Would you mind if I reviewed the construction permits? As a former fire chief, I'm concerned about evacuation routes and fire safety protocols. Paula's smile became even more patronizing. I'm sure our legal team has everything in order. Now, I'll need to ask you to leave our property. Our property. Those words echoed in my head as I walked back to my truck. McLaren Ridge had been in my family since the 1960s. My grandfather died fighting a wildfire on this exact ridge, trying to protect the valley below. The county had designated this area as a permanent wildfire buffer zone after that tragedy. How could they possibly have issued building permits for a commercial structure here? Driving into town, I kept thinking about that cedar post catching fire in my hands. The way it flared up, burned hot and fast, exactly like I'd seen in countless structure fires over the years. If that retreat house caught during peak fire season, with 60 guests inside and no proper evacuation plan, it would be a massacre. The only question was whether I could figure out how to stop it before someone got killed. At the county offices, I requested copies of all building permits for McLaren Ridge property. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain, pulled up the records on her computer. Here we go. Construction permits issued 8 months ago for Summit Wellness Retreat Center, all approved and properly filed. She handed me a stack of photocopies that made my stomach drop. The property transfer documents showed Robert McLaren as the grantor, selling the land to Summit Wellness, HOA, for development purposes. Robert McLaren, my brother Robert, who had been dead for 15 years. Driving back toward the ridge that evening, I parked where I could see the retreat house silhouetted against the darkening sky. The structure loomed there like some kind of monument to greed and stupidity. But watching that retreat house in the sunset glow, I sensed something terrible was coming. The county clerk was already helping the next person in line when I realized what I was looking at. My hands were actually shaking as I spread the documents across the narrow counter space. Robert McLaren's signature, clear as day, on a property transfer dated just 9 months ago. The same Robert who died in a car accident back in 2009. Someone had forged my dead brother's name to steal my family's land. I drove straight to the law office where Sarah and I had updated our wills during her illness. Laura Mitchell had been recommended by Frank Dalton, my old colleague from the fire department. Her father and I had worked together for years before he retired. Laura specialized in environmental law, particularly cases involving wildfire prevention and land use disputes. If anyone could untangle this mess, it would be her. Laura's office sat in a converted Victorian house downtown, with tall windows and original hardwood floors that creaked when you walked. She was younger than I had expected, maybe early 30s, but her handshake was firm and her questions were sharp. When I explained about the forged documents, she leaned back in her leather chair and whistled softly. "Graham, if what you're saying is accurate, we're looking at multiple felonies here. Multiple felonies is right." I handed her the photocopied permits. Robert never owned McLaren Ridge. Our grandfather left the property directly to me when he died. Robert inherited the family house in town, but never had any claim to the Ridge property, and he's been dead since Barack Obama's first year in office. Laura pulled up property records on her computer, cross-referencing ownership history with death certificates and probate records. What she found made the situation even worse. Robert's death certificate clearly showed he died in March 2009. The property transfer was electronically signed in August of last year. But more importantly, the deed research showed that Robert had never held title to McLaren Ridge at any point during his lifetime. Graham, this isn't just fraud. Someone created an entirely fictional ownership history to justify this land grab. Laura dug deeper into Summit Wellness, HOA's corporate structure. The organization was registered as a nonprofit wellness corporation, with Gregory Vaughn listed as development director. She pulled up photos from the company website showing Gregory in expensive suits, standing next to various mountain retreat properties across Colorado. This Vaughn character seems to specialize in developing wellness centers in remote mountain locations. Remote mountain locations that probably shouldn't have any development at all, I muttered, studying Gregory's photograph. He had the kind of polished look that suggested big money and political connections. The website described Ridgeview HOA as pioneering accessible healing spaces in Colorado's most pristine natural environments. What it didn't mention was whether those pristine environments were supposed to be protected wildfire buffer zones. That's when Laura's phone rang. She answered with her professional attorney voice, but I could see her expression change as she listened. Yes, I represent Mr. McLaren. No, we will not be accepting service by phone. You'll need to follow proper procedures. When she hung up, her face was grim. That was Gregory Vaughn's legal team. Apparently you've been served with a restraining order. Before I could respond, there was a knock on Laura's office door. A sheriff's deputy stood outside holding an official-looking envelope. Service for Graham McLaren regarding property access restrictions. The deputy handed me the papers and waited while I signed for them. A temporary restraining order, filed by Summit Wellness, HOA, prohibiting me from approaching or interfering with their retreat property pending resolution of ownership disputes. Laura read through the restraining order while I tried to process what was happening. They're claiming you made threatening statements to their staff and interfered with approved construction activities. They have requested emergency judicial protection based on concerns about your mental state and potential for violence. My mental state? I'd been a first responder for 3 decades. Never had so much as a complaint filed against my professional conduct. The restraining order was thorough and professionally crafted. It cited Colorado statutes regarding trespassing, harassment, and interference with lawful business activities. Gregory had included sworn affidavits from Paula Grant and 2 construction supervisors claiming I had behaved erratically and made statements about destroying their property. These people work fast, Laura observed. This level of legal preparation suggests they were expecting challenges to their project. Looking through the attachments, I found copies of permits and approvals that appeared legitimate on the surface. County building permits, environmental impact assessments, even what looked like approval from the state fire marshal's office. Laura, how is this possible? This property has been a designated wildfire buffer zone since the 1960s. There should be federal restrictions preventing any commercial development. Laura was already searching through federal databases on her computer. That's what we need to determine. If your grandfather's original agreement with the county created permanent conservation restrictions, those would supersede any recent permits, but we'll need to locate the original documentation. She paused, looking up from her screen. Graham, where would your grandfather have kept important family documents? Everything should be in the cabin. Sarah and I never went through his papers after he died. Too painful, I guess. His old fire department trunk is still in the back bedroom. Probably has all his official documents from those years. Laura nodded, making notes on her legal pad. We need to find that original agreement. Without it, we're fighting an uphill battle against what appears to be properly filed permits. The restraining order meant I couldn't go near the retreat property, but it didn't prevent me from accessing my own cabin. How long do we have before this becomes permanent? Laura reviewed the court schedule. Preliminary hearing is set for next Friday. That gives us 6 days to build our case. Meanwhile, Gregory Vaughn has been very busy. According to these financial disclosures, they've pre-sold retreat packages worth over $2 million. $2 million in pre-sales. No wonder they were moving so fast and fighting so hard. This wasn't just about building a wellness center. This was about protecting a major financial investment built on fraudulent foundations. Laura, what happens if we can't prove the fraud before they open for business? She closed the case file and looked at me directly. Then people are going to start using a facility that may not be legally authorized to exist. As I left Laura's office, I kept thinking about Gregory's smile in those website photos. There was something calculated about his expression, like someone who had figured out how to game the system and was proud of his cleverness. But he didn't know that my family had been protecting McLaren Ridge since before he was born. And he definitely didn't know what was waiting in my grandfather's fire department trunk. Gregory smiled, departing. That expression, I've witnessed it before major conflagrations. The next morning, I decided to work within the system one more time before considering alternatives. Frank Dalton had been my colleague for 12 years before I transferred to the county fire department. He was one of the few people who understood both the technical aspects of wildfire prevention and the political realities of mountain development. If anyone could help me navigate this bureaucratic nightmare, it would be Frank. His office at the county fire marshal building hadn't changed much since my retirement. Same metal desk, same stacks of permit applications, same coffee-stained maps covering the walls. Frank looked older though, more tired around the eyes. The job wore on people after a while, especially when politics started interfering with public safety decisions. Graham, good to see you. Though I'm guessing this isn't a social call, I spread the Summit Wellness permits across his desk and explained what I'd discovered about the forged ownership documents. Frank studied the paperwork with the careful attention he'd always brought to fire safety assessments. His expression grew more troubled with each page. Jesus, Graham, I remember reviewing these permits, but I was told the ownership issues had been resolved through proper legal channels. Legal channels involving a man who's been dead since 2009. Frank rubbed his forehead like he was developing a headache. The thing is, I raised concerns about the fire safety aspects when these permits first came through. The timber construction, the location, the lack of adequate evacuation routes. But I was overruled by the county commissioners. He pulled out another file folder. They claimed the retreat would bring significant tourism revenue to the area. Frank showed me his original assessment report, filled with red flags and safety concerns. His recommendations had been comprehensive, including requirements for fire-resistant building materials, sprinkler systems, and multiple evacuation routes. Every single one of his suggestions had been marked as waived by Emergency Economic Development Authorization. I'd never heard of such a thing in 32 years of emergency services. Frank, what the hell is an Emergency Economic Development Authorization? He looked uncomfortable, like someone who'd been forced to compromise his professional standards. It's something the commissioners cooked up last year. Supposedly allows them to fast-track development projects that promise significant economic benefits. In practice, it means they can override safety regulations when developers have enough political influence. The retreat's grand opening was scheduled for the following Friday. Less than 1 week away, with 60 guests already confirmed for the first retreat weekend. Frank's files showed no approved evacuation plan, no fire suppression systems, and no coordination with emergency services for potential rescue operations. If this place catches fire with people inside, we won't be able to get ambulances or fire trucks up that mountain road. I asked Frank about filing an emergency injunction to halt operations until proper safety measures were implemented. His response made my blood run cold. I tried that 3 weeks ago. The commissioners shut it down within 24 hours, said I was exceeding my authority and creating unnecessary obstacles to economic development. The same commissioners who had received campaign contributions from Gregory Vaughn's development company. That afternoon, I decided to try a different approach. Paula Grant had announced a community meeting at the retreat site to showcase the facility and address any remaining concerns. Maybe if I could demonstrate the fire hazards publicly with local residents as witnesses, someone would listen to reason. At minimum, I could document the safety violations for Laura's legal case. The community meeting drew about 40 people, mostly wellness enthusiasts and curious locals. Paula had set up a small stage area near the main entrance, with folding chairs arranged in neat rows. She wore a flowing white dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her smile could have powered the whole retreat center. Welcome everyone to what will soon be our community's premier healing sanctuary. I brought a sample piece of the same cedar timber used in the retreat's construction. During Paula's presentation about mindfulness and natural healing, I quietly conducted a controlled burn demonstration for the people sitting near me. The timber sample caught flame within seconds, burning bright and hot, sending black smoke curling into the mountain air. Several people gasped and moved back from the sudden flare. As you can see, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, the building materials chosen for this retreat are extremely combustible. In dry conditions with mountain winds, this entire structure would become an inferno in minutes. Paula stopped mid-sentence, her wellness guru composure cracking for the first time. Sir, you're disrupting our community event with dangerous and inappropriate behavior. Dangerous and inappropriate? I stamped out the burning timber sample. Ma'am, what's dangerous is putting 60 people inside a tinderbox during fire season. What's inappropriate is building this thing without proper safety measures. The crowd was murmuring among themselves, some people clearly concerned about what they'd just witnessed. Others seemed annoyed that I'd interrupted Paula's presentation. A man in a security uniform approached from the side of the crowd. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. You're trespassing and creating a public disturbance. I looked around at the faces in the crowd, hoping to see understanding or support. Instead, I saw mostly discomfort and irritation. These people wanted to believe in Paula's healing sanctuary, not face uncomfortable realities about fire safety. Paula regained control of the situation with practiced ease. Everyone, I apologize for this unfortunate interruption. What you've just witnessed is exactly the kind of fear-based thinking that prevents communities from embracing positive change and growth. She gestured toward me like I was an exhibit in her wellness museum. This gentleman seems determined to sabotage our project through jealousy and negativity. Jealous of this tinderbox? The words came out harsher than I'd intended. Lady, do you seriously believe that? But the security guard was already escorting me toward the parking area, and the crowd was turning their attention back to Paula's soothing voice. I'd accomplished nothing except making myself look like a crazy person who set things on fire at community meetings. Driving home, I realized that someone had filmed my demonstration with their phone. By evening, the video was circulating online with captions like, "Unhinged former fire chief disrupts healing center opening," and "Local man's bizarre outburst at wellness event." The comments were brutal. People calling me jealous, mentally unstable, a bitter old man trying to destroy something beautiful. The next morning brought a new low point. I woke up to find my cabin's electricity had been shut off. A notice from the power company cited an overdue safety inspection request from county authorities. When I called to inquire, they told me the disconnection was temporary, pending resolution of unspecified safety concerns. Someone had weaponized the bureaucracy against me. Sitting in my dark cabin that night, holding my grandfather's photograph by candlelight, I thought about all the lives he'd tried to save on this same ridge 60 years ago. He'd died protecting people from fire, and now his great-grandson was being portrayed as a dangerous lunatic for trying to do the same thing. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. They're preparing to open the retreat with dozens of occupants. I understand my obligation, but cannot predict the consequences. By Thursday morning, I had reached my breaking point. The retreat opening was scheduled for Friday evening, with the first overnight guests arriving Saturday. 60 people would be sleeping in that death trap within 48 hours. Laura's emergency injunction was still tied up in court proceedings that could take weeks to resolve. The legal system was moving too slowly to prevent what I knew would be a catastrophe. I'd seen this exact scenario before, during my years fighting wildfires in California. A poorly constructed mountain retreat, dry timber construction, inadequate fire suppression, and overconfident owners who dismissed safety concerns. That fire killed 12 people and burned 3,000 acres before we could contain it. I wasn't going to let McLaren Ridge become another memorial to preventable tragedy. The decision crystallized around 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep and found myself staring at weather reports on my phone. Red flag warnings were forecast for the following week, with low humidity and sustained winds up to 30 miles per hour. Perfect conditions for catastrophic fire spread. If the retreat opened as scheduled and caught fire during those conditions, the entire valley could burn. I contacted 3 members of my old fire crew, veterans who understood both the technical requirements and moral imperatives of emergency response. They provided equipment loans without asking too many questions, understanding that sometimes you have to act decisively to prevent loss of life. I wasn't planning vandalism or revenge. This was going to be a professional emergency response operation. At 3:30 in the morning, I drove back to McLaren Ridge. The retreat house sat dark and silent against the starlit sky, a monument to bureaucratic failure and corporate greed. I'd brought my firefighter's axe, the same tool I'd used to save lives for 3 decades. Tonight, I'd use it to prevent deaths instead. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I started by establishing a water perimeter around the structure, standard protocol for any controlled demolition in a fire-prone area. Using a portable pump and hoses borrowed from the fire department, I thoroughly soaked the ground around the building to prevent any accidental ignition. This operation would be methodical, professional, and documented every step of the way. The body camera was essential for legal protection. Every swing of the axe, every piece of timber removed, every safety precaution taken would be recorded as evidence. If I was going to face criminal charges for this action, at least there would be video proof that I'd conducted the operation according to professional emergency response standards. No reckless destruction, no dangerous shortcuts. I started with the support posts, the same untreated cedar timbers that had ignited so easily during my demonstration. Speaking directly to the camera, I explained the combustible properties of each material as I removed it. These posts would become torches in a wildfire, spreading flames to the roof structure within minutes. The entire building would be engulfed before emergency responders could arrive. The work was physically demanding, but emotionally necessary. Each piece of timber I removed was a potential life saved, a family that wouldn't have to endure what I'd witnessed in California. The cedar siding came down in sheets, revealing the wooden frame underneath. Everything combustible, everything dangerous, everything designed to burn fast and hot in mountain wind conditions. Around 5 in the morning, I heard footsteps approaching through the trees. A young woman emerged from the darkness, probably one of Paula's wellness disciples coming for an early morning meditation session. She stared at the partially demolished structure with horror and disbelief. "Oh my God, what are you doing? You're destroying our sanctuary." I paused in my work, holding the axe loosely at my side. The woman looked genuinely heartbroken, like she was watching someone burn down a church. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry for what this looks like, but this structure would kill people. I can't let that happen." She pulled out her phone, probably to call the police or Paula or anyone who could stop this madness. "But this was going to help so many people heal and find peace," she said, tears starting in her eyes. "How can you destroy something so beautiful?" I understood her perspective, really I did. From the outside, this looked like senseless vandalism by a bitter old man. She couldn't see the invisible dangers, the combustible materials, the inadequate escape routes that would become death traps during an emergency. Continuing the demolition while she watched felt brutal, but I couldn't stop now. Too much was at stake, too many lives hanging in the balance. I spoke into the body camera while I worked, knowing this footage might be my only defense against criminal charges. They'll call me an arsonist, but if I don't do this, the whole town burns when wildfire season arrives. By dawn, the retreat house was reduced to a carefully organized pile of salvageable materials. I'd separated the timber by type, stacked the metal components, and arranged everything for potential reuse by whoever might want to build something safer somewhere else. This wasn't destruction for its own sake. This was emergency demolition to prevent loss of life. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning silence. multiple cars, probably Paula and Gregory, and whoever else had been alerted to the overnight demolition. I secured the equipment, packed the body camera footage onto backup drives, and prepared to face whatever consequences were coming. At least the death trap was gone. At least no one would die in that fire. Paula's voice reached me before I could see her approaching through the trees. She was crying, actually sobbing, as she surveyed the debris pile where her wellness sanctuary used to stand. How could you do this? How could you destroy something so beautiful, so healing, so important to our community? Her anguish seemed genuine, which made this moment even harder. Gregory Vaughn arrived a few minutes later, stepping out of an expensive SUV with the kind of controlled fury that suggested serious money and serious consequences. He surveyed the demolition site with calculating eyes, probably already planning lawsuits and criminal charges. When he looked at me, his expression promised that my troubles were just beginning. "Mr. McLaren, I hope you understand the magnitude of what you've just done," Gregory said in the kind of voice people use right before they destroy your life. "This constitutes destruction of private property, valued at over $1.8 million. We'll be pursuing full legal remedies, including criminal charges and civil damages sufficient to compensate our investors and retreat participants. $1.8 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. Even if I was morally and legally justified in the demolition, even if the structure was illegally constructed on stolen land, I didn't have anywhere near that kind of money. They could take the cabin, the property, everything my family had built over 60 years of living on this ridge. Instead of hearing about the public through whispers and posts, I saw myself on the cover of the town paper, black and white, mid-swing, caught by a drone camera during demolition. The headline screamed, "Mountain Maniac Destroys Historic Structure in Personal Vendetta." That night, I found a letter taped to my cabin door, no return address. One line, typed, "You think this is over?" I returned from the hardware store to find survey flags lining the northern ridge, orange markers stabbed into the soil like territorial claims. A sign leaned against a tree, spray-painted in Red Willow Heights Community Pavilion. When I tried to restock fencing supplies, the clerk handed me a city notice instead, a pending petition to restrict land access for public safety. Gregory's name was stamped on it. Walking into town that afternoon felt like entering hostile territory. The clerk at the hardware store, someone I'd known for 15 years, suddenly became very busy with inventory when I approached the counter. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when I entered aisles. People I'd worked alongside, whose homes I'd helped save during past fire emergencies, now crossed streets to avoid making eye contact with me. Someone had spray-painted arsonist across the side of my truck in bright red letters. I stood there in the parking lot of the post office, running my fingers over the jagged words, trying to process how quickly everything had changed. Arsonist. After 3 decades of fighting fires, saving lives, risking my own safety to protect others, I was being branded as someone who started blazes instead of stopping them. The anonymous threats started arriving in my mailbox the next day. Handwritten notes calling me a criminal, a lunatic, a danger to the community. One envelope contained a photograph of my cabin, with a bullseye drawn over it in red marker. Another included a newspaper clipping about vigilante justice with certain phrases highlighted in yellow. I'd dealt with dangerous situations throughout my career, but this felt different. This was personal hatred from people who used to be neighbors. Laura called with updates on the legal situation, but none of it was encouraging. Gregory's attorneys had filed preliminary injunctions to freeze any assets I might use to flee the jurisdiction. They had also requested expedited hearings on both criminal charges and civil damages. Graham, they're moving like people who've done this before. Every document is professionally crafted, every legal maneuver perfectly timed. The worst part was losing support from the fire department community. My former colleagues understood why I'd acted, but department politics prevented them from saying so publicly. Tommy Rodriguez, who'd worked under my command for 8 years, called to apologize. "You know I respect what you did, Chief, but the new administration made it clear that any public support for your actions would result in disciplinary measures." Frank Dalton was forced to issue a public statement condemning my demolition of the retreat. I watched him on the evening news, reading carefully prepared remarks about respecting legal processes and working within established systems. His discomfort was obvious, but he had a pension to protect and a family to support. I couldn't blame him for choosing institutional loyalty over personal friendship. A folded document sat in my mailbox. Civil injunction, temporary, but it came with a map. My land, outlined in red. Restricted until hearing, it said. They'd blocked me from my own mountain. I stood on the border, behind the red tape. I didn't cross. Not because I agreed, but because I was counting the moves. I started packing the cabin, preparing to sell the property and relocate somewhere nobody knew my name or my story. The real estate agent I contacted was sympathetic but realistic about my prospects. Given the current publicity and pending legal issues, it might be difficult to find buyers willing to meet your asking price. Even my family's land had been contaminated by this controversy. Laura's investigation into Gregory's business practices was revealing disturbing patterns. Ridgeview HOA wasn't just operating in our county. They'd developed similar wellness retreats across 3 other Colorado mountain communities, always in high fire risk areas, always using the same rapid development tactics. Each project generated millions in pre-sale revenue before construction was completed. The State Fire Prevention Office had been quietly monitoring Vaughn Development Corporation for over a year. According to Laura's contacts in state government, they suspected Gregory of deliberately targeting combustible locations because insurance payouts from fire losses exceeded construction costs. It was a business model based on inevitable disaster, with human lives as acceptable collateral damage. But none of that information would help me in court. The legal system required proof, not suspicion, and Gregory's operation was sophisticated enough to maintain plausible deniability. His permits appeared legitimate, his insurance policies were properly filed, and his political connections ran deep enough to influence local law enforcement priorities. I was fighting a machine designed to crush individuals who got in its way. Sitting alone in the cabin that night, surrounded by boxes of belongings I might never unpack again, I thought about calling it quits. Just pay whatever settlement they demanded, sign whatever documents they required, disappear quietly, and let them build their death traps wherever they wanted. Maybe I was getting too old for these battles, too tired to keep fighting systems bigger than myself. The signed cabin sale papers sat on my kitchen table, ready for submission to the county clerk's office. All I had to do was drive into town, file the documents, and this nightmare would be someone else's problem. Let the next fire chief deal with Gregory's combustible retreats. Let the next homeowner worry about protecting McLaren Ridge from development. Let someone younger and stronger carry the burden I'd inherited from my grandfather. But every time I reached for those papers, I thought about the 60 people who would have been sleeping in that retreat house during red flag fire conditions. Families with children, elderly couples seeking peace in their retirement, young adults trying to heal from life's traumas. All of them potential victims of Gregory's profitable negligence. All of them saved by my decision to act decisively. I drove to Gregory's office complex that evening, parking across the street and watching lights in the windows of Vaughn Development Corporation. For an hour, I sat in my truck considering whether to confront him directly, to demand answers about his business model and his plans for other mountain communities. Maybe if I could record him admitting to the insurance fraud scheme, Laura would have enough evidence to stop his operation. But approaching Gregory would violate the restraining order and probably result in immediate arrest. I'd already sacrificed my reputation and financial security to stop one deadly project. Getting myself thrown in jail wouldn't help anyone, and it might prevent me from interfering with his next scheme. Sometimes the smart move is tactical retreat, even when every instinct screams for direct confrontation. Driving home past the debris pile where the retreat used to stand, I realized something fundamental had shifted in my thinking. I wasn't planning to surrender anymore. Gregory had made this personal by targeting my family's land, forging my brother's signature, trying to destroy everything my grandfather had worked to protect. This wasn't just about fire safety now. This was about justice. Sarah once told me, "Some fires clean the forest." That headline made her words feel like prophecy twisted against me. Have you ever been universally rejected by people you spent decades serving? What would you choose, capitulation or fighting until the bitter end? At 3:12 in the morning, headlights swept across my cabin wall. I didn't go outside. I just watched the shadows move and wondered who else thought they owned this land now. They made me sit through a civic ethics review. I expected lectures. What I didn't expect was the promo video they played, footage from Gregory's speech at a property expo last spring. He spoke of pioneering a shared development model, then mentioned the parcel ID of my land. He said it was soon to be reclassified. The date on the video? 4 months before the house was built. The trunk had been sitting in my grandfather's bedroom for 15 years, untouched since the day he died. Sarah and I had always meant to go through his papers and belongings, but it felt too painful, too chunnel. After her death, facing another round of grief seemed impossible. But now, with everything falling apart around me, maybe it was time to confront whatever secrets the old man had left behind. The heavy wooden chest was military surplus from his time in Korea, reinforced with metal corners and secured with a brass lock that had turned green with age. I'd seen him access it occasionally during my childhood, usually when dealing with property tax assessments or insurance claims. He'd always been secretive about its contents, protective in a way that suggested important family business was stored inside. Finding the key took another 20 minutes of searching through his dresser drawers and coat pockets. When I finally located it tucked inside an old tobacco tin, my hands were shaking with anticipation and dread. Whatever was in that trunk had been significant enough for him to keep locked away for decades. I wasn't sure I was ready for more family revelations. The lid opened with a loud creak, releasing the smell of old paper and leather that reminded me of his garage workshop. Inside were dozens of file folders, photograph albums, official documents sealed in protective plastic, and his ceremonial fire department dress uniform wrapped in tissue paper. The organization was meticulous, everything labeled and dated according to his military precision standards. The folder labeled McLaren Ridge Property Agreement was thicker than the others, filled with correspondence between my grandfather and various government agencies. The original document was typed on official U.S. Forest Service letterhead, dated September 19, 1964. Reading the formal language, I began to understand why he'd been so protective of this information. Following the devastating wildfire that killed 12 people and burned 8,000 acres, the federal government had designated McLaren Ridge as a permanent wildfire buffer zone. My grandfather had donated the eastern slope to the county in perpetuity, with the understanding that no commercial structures would ever be built without written authorization from the McLaren family. The agreement was co-signed by the Forest Service, registered with the Department of Interior, and filed as part of the National Wildfire Prevention Database. The emotional impact hit me harder than the legal implications. My grandfather had lost friends in that 1964 fire, including his volunteer fire chief mentor, who died trying to evacuate a mountain retreat similar to Gregory's Wellness Center. The property donation wasn't just about preventing future development. It was about honoring the memory of people who died protecting others from exactly this kind of preventable tragedy. Laura's reaction to the federal agreement was immediate and electric. "Graham, this changes everything. Federal environmental protection supersedes county permits, state regulations, even local political pressure. If Summit Wellness built their retreat without McLaren family authorization, they violated federal law. Her voice carried the excitement of someone who had just found the smoking gun in a complex legal case. But the document revealed more than just legal protection. It included detailed correspondence between my grandfather and federal fire management agencies, discussing his professional expertise and family commitment to wildfire prevention. He'd been recognized as a regional authority on mountain fire ecology, someone whose opinions carried weight with government officials and insurance investigators. Reading through his letters to federal agencies, I discovered that my firefighting career hadn't been a coincidence or family tradition. It had been a deliberate continuation of his life's work, a conscious decision to honor his sacrifice and carry forward his mission of protecting mountain communities from fire disasters. He'd wanted someone in the family to understand the technical and emotional complexities of wildfire prevention. The trunk also contained photographs from the 1964 fire, images I'd never seen before, showing the aftermath of the disaster. Burned foundations where mountain retreats used to stand, charred vehicles abandoned on evacuation routes, aerial shots of the devastation that had motivated his donation of the Ridge property. The visual evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. One photograph showed my grandfather standing beside the remains of a 3-story wooden lodge that had burned completely, killing 8 guests who couldn't escape through smoke-filled stairwells. The structural design was almost identical to Gregory's retreat center, down to the cedar construction and single-access road. History was repeating itself, and I was the only person positioned to break the cycle. Laura spent the afternoon researching federal databases, confirming the legal status of the wildfire buffer agreement. Every search produced the same result. McLaren Ridge remained under federal protection, with any commercial development requiring specific authorization from the McLaren family. Gregory's permits were worthless, his construction illegal, his entire business model built on fraudulent foundations. After class, a woman caught up with me in the hall. She whispered, "I reviewed that parcel last year. It wasn't on any transfer list. Something's off." She didn't give her name, but the federal agreement also carried tremendous responsibility. My grandfather had sacrificed prime development land to protect the valley below, trusting that future generations of McLarens would honor his commitment to wildfire prevention. Looking through more of his correspondence, I found letters discussing other attempts to develop the Ridge property over the decades. Real estate developers, tourism companies, even government agencies had tried to circumvent the federal agreement. My grandfather had successfully fought off every challenge, sometimes through legal action, sometimes through political pressure, always with unwavering determination to protect lives. The final folder contained his personal reflections on the 1964 fire, handwritten pages describing the horror of searching through burned retreat lodges for victims who hadn't escaped in time. His writing was matter-of-fact but emotionally devastating, a professional's clinical description of preventable tragedy. He'd seen what happened when profit motives overrode fire safety, and he'd devoted the rest of his life to ensuring it never happened again. Reading his words by candlelight in the powerless cabin, I felt a profound connection to his mission and his sacrifice. This wasn't just about stopping Gregory's development anymore. This was about honoring the memory of 12 people who died in flames, about fulfilling the promise my grandfather had made to protect this valley, about ensuring that future generations wouldn't have to endure what he'd witnessed in 1964. When I returned to the cabin, another drone hovered above the ridge, just watching. I waved. It didn't move. Maybe I did overreact, but not about the threat, only its scale. Gregory wasn't just stealing space. He was laying legal minefields. I printed the frame where Gregory said the parcel ID. I highlighted the date, and I knew exactly who needed to see it next. Laura arranged the public hearing at the county courthouse for Tuesday morning, giving us enough time to prepare a comprehensive presentation of the federal wildfire agreement. Word spread quickly through the community, and by 9 a.m., over 300 people had gathered in the main courtroom. Local television crews from 3 stations set up cameras along the back wall, sensing that this story was about to take a dramatic turn. I wore my dress uniform from the fire department, the same one I'd worn to retirement ceremonies and fallen firefighter memorials. The symbolism was intentional. This wasn't just about property rights or legal technicalities anymore. This was about honoring the professional standards and moral obligations that had guided my entire career. The uniform reminded everyone present that I'd earned the right to speak about fire safety through decades of service. The courthouse atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. Paula Grant sat in the front row, surrounded by her wellness community supporters, many wearing matching white scarves as symbols of unity and healing. Gregory Vaughn occupied the opposite side with his legal team, expensive suits and briefcases arranged like battle formations. Between them sat curious residents who'd followed this controversy through weeks of media coverage. Laura began our presentation with military precision, outlining the timeline of events and the discovery of fraudulent ownership documents. She displayed enlarged copies of Robert McLaren's death certificate alongside the forged property transfer, making the chronological impossibility obvious to everyone in the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, you cannot sign legal documents 15 years after your death. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Laura unveiled the original 1964 Federal Wildfire Agreement, projected onto screens visible throughout the courtroom. The official seals, government letterheads, and formal language carried undeniable authority. This document establishes McLaren Ridge as a permanent federal wildfire buffer zone with commercial development prohibited without McLaren family written consent. I took the podium to explain the historical context and professional significance of the agreement. Using photographs from my grandfather's collection, I showed the devastation caused by the 1964 fire that killed 12 people in mountain retreat lodges similar to Gregory's Wellness Center. These victims died because profit motives overrode fire safety considerations. My grandfather donated this land to prevent future tragedies. The presentation included current satellite imagery showing the extreme combustible loads surrounding the retreat site, weather data demonstrating red flag fire conditions, and evacuation route analysis proving the inadequacy of emergency access. During peak fire season, this structure would have ignited within minutes and spread flames throughout the valley before emergency responders could arrive. Federal investigators arrived during the presentation, their timing coordinated with Laura's legal strategy. Federal agent from the Department of Interior introduced herself to the court and announced a formal federal investigation into Vaughn Development Corporation. We're examining potential violations of the National Wildfire Prevention Act and fraudulent circumvention of federal environmental protections. The federal intervention shifted the entire dynamic of the hearing. County commissioners who'd been defending Gregory's project suddenly became very quiet, realizing their political careers were at stake. Agent Chen revealed that federal investigators had been monitoring Vaughn development for months, following similar pattern violations across 3 other Colorado mountain communities. Frank Dalton finally found his voice and his courage. Taking the witness stand, he admitted that he had been coerced into approving permits that violated his professional judgment. I documented numerous fire safety violations in my original assessment, but county commissioners overruled my recommendations using their emergency economic development authorization. Graham McLaren was correct about every single safety concern. But the climactic moment came when Gregory himself took the stand, supposedly to defend his company's reputation and business practices. Under pressure from federal agents and mounting evidence of fraud, his composed corporate demeanor began cracking. Laura's cross-examination was relentless, forcing him to explain the forged documents, the rushed construction timeline, and the financial structure of his pre-sale packages. Then Agent Chen asked the question that shattered everything. Mr. Vaughn, our investigation has revealed insurance policies on your mountain developments that far exceed construction costs. Can you explain why your coverage amounts are so disproportionate to actual property values? Gregory's face went white as he realized the trap he'd walked into. His response was the confession that ended his career and vindicated my actions. Look, the bigger the fire gets, the more insurance money comes in. That's just sound business practice. The courtroom erupted in gasps and angry murmurs as people processed what they'd just heard. Gregory had essentially admitted to building fire traps for insurance profit. I leaned forward in my seat, hardly believing what I'd witnessed. You just confessed to everything. To you, people's lives are just insurance profits waiting to happen. Gregory tried to backtrack, claiming his words had been taken out of context, but the damage was irreversible. Federal agents immediately began questioning him about insurance fraud conspiracy. The community reaction was instantaneous and explosive. People who had supported the Wellness Retreat project began shouting questions about Gregory's true motives. Paula Grant looked devastated, realizing she'd been used as a front for a criminal enterprise. Her healing sanctuary had been nothing more than a profitable death trap designed to generate insurance claims. Video of Gregory's confession spread across social media within minutes, carried by the same networks that had vilified my demolition weeks earlier. The narrative flipped completely. Instead of a dangerous old man destroying something beautiful, I became the hero who'd prevented a massacre. Comment sections filled with apologies and admiration for my courage. As the hearing concluded, something extraordinary happened. The entire courtroom rose in spontaneous applause, 300 people expressing gratitude for actions they'd condemned just hours earlier. I felt tears in my eyes as neighbors who had shunned me for weeks now approached to shake my hand and apologize for doubting my motives. The vindication was overwhelming and emotional, but I knew this was just the beginning of a larger battle. Gregory's operation extended across multiple states, putting countless mountain communities at risk. The federal investigation would take months to complete, and other developers were probably using similar tactics to circumvent fire safety regulations. The entire community rose applauding, but I understood the genuine battle was just commencing. 18 months later, I stood on McLaren Ridge watching children learn about wildfire prevention at the new Fire Safety Training Center. The settlement money from Ridgeview HOA had funded something far more valuable than any wellness retreat could have been. Instead of a death trap disguised as healing sanctuary, we'd built an educational facility that would protect mountain communities for generations. The federal court's final ruling had been comprehensive and satisfying. My demolition was declared legally justified emergency action preventing imminent loss of life, which felt like vindication but couldn't fully repair the emotional damage from months of community rejection. More importantly, the court ordered Summit Wellness to pay $400,000 in damages plus legal fees, money that became the foundation for our fire safety mission. Gregory Vaughn's criminal trial had been a spectacle of justice finally served. Federal prosecutors charged him with conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, wire fraud, and violation of federal environmental protection laws. The evidence was overwhelming, including recorded conversations with insurance adjusters discussing acceptable loss ratios for mountain retreat properties. His sentencing to 8 years in federal prison made headlines across Colorado. Paula Grant had quietly disappeared from the community shortly after the hearing, avoiding civil liability by cooperating with federal investigators. Her wellness empire collapsed when investors realized they'd been financing criminal enterprises disguised as healing centers. The last I heard, she was working as a yoga instructor in Arizona, presumably staying far away from mountain development projects. The county commissioners who'd enabled Gregory's scheme faced their own reckoning at the ballot box. Voters replaced all three with candidates who promised transparency and accountability in development approval processes. The Emergency Economic Development Authorization was repealed, and new ordinances required fire chief approval for any mountain construction projects. But the systemic changes extended far beyond our local community. Federal oversight programs were established for wildfire buffer zones across the western states, preventing similar fraud schemes in other vulnerable mountain areas. The McLaren Ridge case became a model for protecting critical fire prevention infrastructure from developer manipulation and political corruption. The memorial we established at the original retreat site serves multiple purposes. Interactive exhibits demonstrate combustible material behavior, teaching visitors why certain building materials create extreme fire hazards in mountain environments. Children can safely observe controlled burns that show how quickly untreated timber ignites compared to fire-resistant alternatives. Standing beside the bronze plaque that honors my grandfather and the 12 victims of the 1964 fire, I often think about the interconnected nature of prevention and memory. McLaren Ridge Wildfire Buffer Zone, protected by federal agreement since 1964, defended by 3 generations of McLaren fire chiefs. The inscription captures both our family's commitment and the community's responsibility to honor that sacrifice. The training center partners with state fire academies and the U.S. Forest Service, offering free wildfire education programs for residents and first responders. We've trained over 2,000 people in fire prevention techniques, evacuation planning, and emergency response coordination. Every person who learns these skills potentially saves lives during future fire emergencies. Today's group consisted of 30 elementary students from the Valley schools, wide-eyed and attentive, as I explained how wind patterns carry flames across mountain terrain. Their teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had specifically requested the field trip after hearing about our education programs. These children need to understand the environment they're growing up in, both its beauty and its dangers. I showed them the exact spot where Gregory's retreat would have stood, explaining how the structure's placement would have created a wind tunnel effect during fire conditions. Instead of a building that would burn and spread flames, we now have open space that helps protect the valley below. Sometimes preventing disaster is more important than building something new. One girl raised her hand with the kind of serious expression that suggested she'd been thinking carefully about our discussion. "Mr. McLaren, why did those people want to build something dangerous?" It was a profound question that deserved an honest answer. Sometimes adults make bad decisions when they care more about money than safety. That's why we need people like you to ask good questions and speak up when something doesn't seem right. Frank Dalton retired early after the federal investigation, but he volunteers regularly at the training center, teaching new firefighters about the political pressures that can compromise safety decisions. Young people need to understand that doing the right thing sometimes means standing alone against systems bigger than yourself. Graham showed us what courage looks like when everything is at stake. The personal healing has been slower than the institutional changes. Trust, once broken, requires time and consistent action to rebuild. But gradually, neighbors who'd shunned me during the controversy have become allies in our fire prevention mission. The hardware store clerk who'd ignored me during my darkest weeks now donates materials for our demonstration projects. And maybe that's why it all had to happen. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for this. Kids who know how to protect what's theirs, families who sleep without fear, and a ridgeline that still breathes. Maybe the real lesson here is that legacy isn't something you inherit, it's something you defend. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.